We've talked about glucose metabolism now. So we've got one short-term, phosphocreatine, for just filling in the gap till glucose metabolism can kick in. And then we've talked about what happens with glucose and how we can generate a lot of ATP from it through aerobic metabolism, even if it's a little slower, or less ATP but very fast through anaerobic metabolism. There is another option, which is only really workable when you have when your demands for ATP are not very fast, when you don't need it quickly, but it can generate a lot of it, and that's fatty acid metabolism. So just to remind everyone, a fatty acid is a hydrocarbon chain that on one end has a carboxyl group, and then coming from that you've then got some long string of carbons with hydrogens on them. So what I'm drawing here would be considered a saturated fatty acid because every carbon has as many hydrogens on it as possible. So this would be considered an 8-carbon saturated fatty acid. You probably remember these a little bit from when we talked about them in the biomolecules part in the core concepts. They are lipophilic. They're usually found in triglycerides or phospholipids, but they can be broken off and then used as an energy source in muscle cells. And here's how that works. It's kind of a two-step process, and the first step is beta oxidation. We're not going to go into all of the details on exactly how beta oxidation works. The short version is we take the last 2 carbons in the molecule and we break them off, forming what's called an acyl unit. And in the process of breaking off those last 2 carbons, we're actually going to get an NAD plus becoming an NADH and an FAD becoming an FADH2. Those come just in that process of beta oxidation, which is breaking off the last 2 carbons of the fatty acid. That acyl unit then gets converted to an acetyl-CoA, which can go through the Krebs cycle. Now, keep in mind, this is one acetyl-CoA, not like the 2 that we looked at in the glucose metabolism. So in this, instead of 6 NAD pluses, we're going to get 3 NAD plus becoming 3 NADH, 1 FAD becoming 1 FADH2, and 1 ATP directly. So we break off those last 2 carbons, we turn it into an acyl unit, which becomes an acetyl-CoA, which then goes through the Krebs cycle. And we can now take all of the NADH and FADH2 we've made, so that's now 4 NADH and 2 FADH2s, and put those through oxidative metabolism. So remember, that gives us 2.5 ATP each here, so that's 10. 1.5 ATP each here, that's 3, plus the 1 ATP gives us a total of 14. So when you're metabolizing this fatty acid, when I break off that last 2 carbons, from that whole process, between breaking it off, running that through the Krebs cycle, and running all of the NADH and FADH2 through oxidative phosphorylation, net gain from that last 2 carbons is going to be 14 ATP, which we can then do again with the next 2 carbons. So that is going to be worth another 14 ATP, using the same process overall. And the next 2. So there's another 14 ATP. Now the last two carbons, I can turn those into an acyl unit as well. However, since I don't have to break them off anything, I don't get the NADH and FADH2 that I got from breaking it off. That just becomes an acyl unit on its own, which then goes through the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. So from that, I'm going to get the 1 ATP from the Krebs cycle. So that's 1 ATP directly from the Krebs cycle. 1 FADH2 times 1.5 is 1.5 ATP. 3 NADH times 2.5, that's 7.5 ATP, for a total of 10, just from that last one. From that last pair of carbons, I don't get the extra that I get from the breaking off process. I just get what I get from the acetyl-CoA and from the oxidative phosphorylation. So let's take a look at what our total from a fatty acid is. For each 2-carbon piece, except the last, we get 14 ATP. From the last 2-carbon piece, the one that doesn't have to break off of anything, we get 10 ATP. And there's one more thing. To get the whole process started, to start the first breaking off process, so cost to break off the first one, that costs us 2. We have to put 2 ATP into the process to get it started. So fatty acids in human systems almost always come in even numbers of carbons. So let's imagine a 14-carbon fatty acid. How do we figure out how many ATP we get from that? It's 14 carbons. That divides up into 7 2-carbon pieces. In 14 carbons, if I put it into pieces of 2 each, that's 7. 6 of those will get me 14 each, because those are the ones I have to break off. So 6 times 14 is 84 ATP. 1, that last one, gives me 10. And then I have to take off the 2 to start it. So my total is, I get 92 ATP out of a 14-carbon fatty acid. So you might be asked to solve that problem. How many ATP do I get from a fatty acid of some particular length? That's how you would do it. Now, let's talk about, this obviously generates a lot of ATP. So let's talk about why we would ever not do this. So the advantages of this are that it produces the most ATP. So it gives you the fats carry the most energy. This is how we extract energy from fat, and fat carries more than twice as much energy for unit weight than carbohydrates like glucose do. On the other hand, it has some disadvantages. It requires oxygen. You might ask, why does it require oxygen? Well, just for a moment. Notice we're doing this Krebs cycle here. The Krebs cycle takes place in the mitochondria, and it produces NADH and FADH2, and to use those, you have to run them through the electron transport chain, which requires oxygen. This is using the same machinery that we used for glucose metabolism. The Krebs cycle and the ETC that we used to metabolize the NADH and FADH2, same stuff that we used in glucose. So it has some of the same requirements. So this requires oxygen. because it uses the electron transport chain. It requires the mitochondria. So it's effectively an aerobic process. And it's very slow. Why is it so slow? I'm not entirely sure. My understanding is that beta oxidation process, the process of breaking off that fat, that part from the fatty acid, and transforming it into an acyl unit and then to acetyl-CoA, is for some reason quite slow. So while we get a lot of ATP out of this, we get it at a relatively slow rate. We get sort of a trickle of ATP coming from this as opposed to a relatively rapid flood from glucose metabolism, which affects when we can use it. So let's imagine some different conditions. First of all, let's imagine you're sitting on the couch watching Netflix. If you're watching Netflix, you're not burning much energy. So your muscle cells aren't doing much, and they don't really need to do fatty acid metabolism. They can get by on low levels of aerobic glucose metabolism, which is nice and efficient and uses a fuel you've already got. It's easy, not a problem. If you're going to go do an intense workout, say lifting weights, something where your ATP demands are very, very high, you need a lot of ATP quickly, you're not going to be able to do fatty acid metabolism for that. It's just too slow. Even though it generates lots of ATP, the ATP doesn't come out fast enough. For something like that, you're mostly going to do anaerobic glucose metabolism because it's the fastest mechanism after phosphocreatine, which only lasts a few minutes. Aerobic glucose metabolism is still fairly fast, and you might do some of it depending on what kind of shape you're in, but a lot of that's going to be anaerobic. Third situation, let's say you go out for an hour's walk. A walk is generally aerobic exercise. You're usually able to get plenty of oxygen to your muscles during that. You don't find yourself gasping for breath usually. When you start on something like that, you'll mostly be doing aerobic glucose metabolism. But as you do a low impact exercise like that, where the ATP demands are not huge, your muscles will gradually shift to fatty acid metabolism because it's actually the most efficient kind of metabolism. So if the demands are not high and you're going to be doing it for a while, the longer you do it, the more you shift to burning fatty acids for fuel rather than glucose. It's easy to guess from that, oh good, it's my method to weight loss, and that's not exactly how it works. Your body can convert glucose into fats and vice versa. So it's really, to a first approximation, it's just how many calories you burn, not where they come from. It's actually more subtle than that, and what kind of metabolism you're doing does seem to have health effects. There is a lot of advantage to sustained moderate exercise as compared to short-term intense, although they're both good and both have different benefits. But don't assume that because you're burning fats that immediately means you're burning body fat entirely or that you're clearing out your arteries or anything like that. Maybe, maybe not. But just so you know, extended exercise like that, extended lower demand exercise, does cause your muscles to shift to fatty acid metabolism as opposed to primarily glucose. And the longer you do it, the more of the fats you're burning. So now you've learned about skeletal muscle. You've learned about how it's arranged, all of the structures inside it, how it's controlled, how it twitches, and how it uses energy. In the last lecture of the muscular system, we're mostly going to be talking about smooth muscle and how it's different from skeletal muscle. So you'll talk about how it's arranged differently, differences in how it works, differences in how the contraction mechanism works, why it doesn't have the striations. For example, you might say that means its actin and myosin probably aren't arranged in sarcomeres because that's what gives us the striations. And then, yeah, that'll pretty much cover it. So I'll see you for that last lecture when you get there.